Good morning. It's a thrill to be here with you today. The more and more I learn about Washoe County, the more and more impressed I am. Now, you all have been sitting for quite a while, though, so I think it might be a good opportunity here just to stand up for a second. So let's just stand up. I recently joined a new CrossFit gym, and they're really good there. If we've done something for too long and it's like wearing on us, they say, okay, stop and just shake it out. So just, shake it out a little bit, move your legs, your feet, that type of thing. And it's tough sitting that long in chairs, right? At least it is for me. But you all are sitting together, you're in it together. I'm very thankful that you're in it with me. So just turn to someone and say, thanks for being in it with me. And now that I could see the whole room from this vantage point, you all look great. So turn to that person and say, you look amazing. And, it's a real pleasure to be in a district that's prioritized equity to the point where, through my conversations with Tiffany and others in the district, you're expressing values by placing equity positioning it in a place in the district where it permeates everything, really approaching a systemic approach to equity instead of, placing it off in a corner somewhere with one person, maybe down, tucked under, and buried at the bottom of an organizational chart. So you all are just positioned to be a national leader for us in this area. So let's give your partner a high five and say, we rock. So yeah, go ahead and settle back in here. It's also really humbling and an honor just to look around and see my book, at the tables. This was really a labor of love. What it was an attempt for me to document about 15 years of equity work. And, there's no real blueprint out there as far as how to get this thing done, or else we'd be there, right? We'd have closed all those educational gaps. We wouldn't have the disproportionality that we could predict by student demographic group or identity group. So this was an attempt to document about 15 years of my learning and 15 years of work with facilitating transformative growth for schools, for teams, for organizations. And the big goal, the overarching goal, was really to offer something to leaders that would help them do their own work on their own transformative equity journey, but also to help leaders help their schools, help their offices, help their organizations move along on their journeys. So that brings us here to a little video that we're going to experience together. This was something I came across a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen it. To me, immediately it resonated with me, because it represented to me where we're going on this journey, basically where we're heading. Okay, so this may look familiar to you, but I know for sure this is the first time that we all have experienced this video together. So enjoy.
heart doesn't see race.
Love has no age limit.
That's my best friend.
We are neighbors and best friends.
We all have different religions, but we have universal love as well.
I love my sister.
Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
Take the next 60 seconds and talk to someone at your table about where you how this might represent where you think we're heading with equity work. It just sounds so loud. Okay, please let's come back together. Okay, there's some truth in this video. There's something that resonates with me at a very, very deep level. And you might be familiar with ad campaigns, you know, Love Has No Labels campaign. There's a hair to split there, though, and I think it's really captured in a statement that one of the young ladies said in the video, which is, "My heart doesn't see race." It might be really easy to confuse some of the messaging in there with the concept of colorblindness, because while there may be some truth, there is truth there when she says, "My heart doesn't see race." The thing is, our eyes do, and our perception does. And so we're going to get into that here as we move through this hour. With this work, one of our big picture goals of equity work really is to eliminate the damaging effect of labels, effects that show up, for example, in disproportionate disparities between cultural groups in schools and also in society. In truth, most of the labels in and of themselves that we place on ourselves that has to do with our identity, really, that's not the problem. That's not the actual problem. The dimensions of our identities and how we see ourselves just simply aren't the problem. How we see ourselves as black, white, Asian, Hispanic, gay, straight, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, able-bodied, able-minded, disabled, etc., those dimensions are not the problem. What is the problem are the meanings that we attach to some of those, and also the labels that we put on others. I'm talking about the deeply ingrained structural, subconscious, and implicit associations and biases that we have associated with the ways that we categorize each other. These are the associations that give people either unfair or unearned advantages or disadvantages. And it's really clear in the educational research, so let's take a look at that. How many are you familiar with the visible learning body of research from Professor John Hattie? We have a few. It's pretty extraordinary. It is the largest study in history, in the history of the world. I just want to extend it. It's in the history of the universe. This is the biggest, just database warehouse of research. So it's a meta-analysis on meta-analyses. So it's like research on the research on the research. Kind of reminds me of that movie Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio, like a dream within a dream within a dream. It starts to like bend your mind at some point. But Professor Hattie is out of Australia, and his research is worldwide, and here's how big it is. Just 3 years ago, and it's constantly updating, so this is 3 years ago, it included over 1,000 meta-analyses, which included over 50,000 research studies, which included over 240 million students worldwide. Okay, so we're talking about a real sizable body of work, very substantial. So what he did, he set out to see what works best in classrooms. Not what works, because what he found out is just about everything we do works. It has some effect on student achievement and student learning. But what works best? Because students are going to learn despite us sometimes, or in spite of us. So for example, he learned that cooperative learning had an effect size of 0.41. Okay? And as you can see from this graphic, which I think is probably the most useful thing from his body of work, he calls it the barometer of influence. He found that the hinge point, what he calls the hinge point, is 0.40 for an effect size. So 0.40 equates to 1 year's worth of student growth for 1 year in the classroom, right? And it's not to say that we should stop doing things that fall below 0.40, like homework, for instance. Homework's like an effect size of 0.15. But we need to have really intentional and meaningful conversations about what we do and why we do it, right? And we need not to isolate these influences, because there's about 200 of them now. So cooperative learning is one. I picked that one because 0.41 is right about there. It's good, right? We're like responsible practitioners, you know. So 0.40 is what starts what he calls the zone of desired effects, when we're talking about really making an impact on student learning and even getting to the point where we can double and triple the speed of learning. Basically, 0.40 is what should happen. So one of the biggest effects that he found was not labeling students. It had an effect size of 0.61. Now just think about that for a second. If we really wanted to focus in on one thing, and we just collectively decided, you know what, we're going to focus on rethinking how we categorize students, rethinking how we label students, and we're going to have to do some serious mind frame shifts because we've been trained to think about each other that way and to categorize each other. But if we really wanted to get our act together and focus on removing the labels that we put on students, what this implies is that might equate to a year and a half worth of student growth for 1 year in the classroom, right? So I've been kind of fascinated by this, so I've tried to find out more. And so I've had conversations with the folks around Professor Hattie and Professor Hattie about this. And it's kind of interesting, out of the 200 plus influences that have emerged from the study, this is the only one that is phrased with the word not at the beginning. So just think about that. I just had this revelation just like a couple of months ago. So I said, does that mean that labeling students has an effect size of negative 0.61? And he said, exactly, which by far is the most negative influence. Because the second, right now, if you look at the study, the biggest negative influence is student mobility, which is a negative 0.30. We're talking about a negative 6.1. So, you know, some of the phrases that we put around labeling, like labeling is disabling, it's just true. And labeling is enabling because kids that we might call gifted and talented probably believe that they're gifted and talented, right? So anyway, I'm bringing this up to kind of set a foundation for our talk here today. I'm going to move beyond labeling students, but this is such a core part of the work of equity, is undoing the way that we categorize each other, rethinking and unlearning things like racism. Just to extend this a little farther, positive teacher-student relationships, which we're going to come back to, has an even bigger effect size. It's almost 2 years' worth of growth for 1 year in the classroom. It's effect size of 0.72. Now, we need to look at, like, okay, so what do we mean by teacher-student relationships? Because pretty much everyone has a teacher-student relationship, right? Some are good, some are bad, some end up in the newspaper that definitely don't impact student achievement. So we'll come back to this and look at what exactly does that mean, 0.72. Okay, I want to tell you a story here about a colleague of mine, Lauren Beeman. Lauren is currently an assistant principal, but when I met her, she was a graduate student. She was a teacher. She was part of the class that I was teaching at Johns Hopkins University that was part of her administration and supervision certification program. And she had just completed, the course before mine was an action research course. So here's the long and short of it. A few years ago, Lauren was a 5th grade teacher before she was an administrator. Now in this team, it was an elementary school, and they grouped students according to perceived ability, which is a very common practice, and which, by the way, is very interesting when you look at that body of work of visible learning research, because it's not at all a high impact strategy. It's like 0.18. So we really need to think carefully about how and why we group students by ability. Anyway, they did this as standard practice for math class. So for math, basically, the situation is they would leave their homeroom and go to another teacher. So for instance, one teacher would have the group labeled above grade level, one teacher would have the labeled on grade level, and one would have the group labeled below grade level. Does this resonate with you here in Washoe County? Is this a familiar practice? Well, one of her teammates expressed frustration because she had the group labeled on grade level, and this was the biggest group, right? You can imagine that. So they had a lot of paperwork to do in this district, a lot of quarterly assessments. So she had about double the amount of quarterly assessments for math than the teacher who taught above grade level. So she was really complaining about workload. This isn't a fair practice. So Lauren, being the team leader, had a solution. And she just said, well, I'll take half of the on-grade level students and I'll just teach 2 groups. And she just called it the 2-group math model. But she was going to teach 2 groups. She was going to even it out and solve the situations. Just, she thought she had a solution until, and you can imagine this, she overheard some of the students who were being moved, she overheard them talking while they were lining up for lunch. Just imagine what they were saying. They thought they were being, quote, moved up, right? They thought they were being promoted. They were all excited, saying, I just got moved up. I'm in the above group. So here they are excited. You know, their efficacy was raising. And here's Lauren with a dilemma. Does she burst their bubble and say, oh no, you're really not all that, you know? Or, you know, does she allow them to keep their beliefs and maybe change practice? So luckily, Lauren was a part of this action research class at the time. She literally went home and slept on it and realized, this is going to be my action research project. So she clued in the school counselors, the administrators, the parents, everyone agreed to this. And they were going to allow the students to keep their beliefs about their grouping, and she was going to provide the support that they needed without anyone noticing. She was going to use flexible grouping within that group. She was going to mix them up as much as she could. She was going to give them the extra praise for what they needed to be doing that they hadn't quite learned yet. She was going to fill in the gaps, etc. And sure enough, within one marking period, every one of her students passed the above grade level assessment. Furthermore, at the end of the year, she couldn't distinguish who were the students who got moved in and who were the ones that were already there. And just to go further, Lauren's pretty exceptional. She tracked them through their she kept track of them through their middle school experience, and all of them remained in the above grade level trajectory. And we could unpack a lot of what went on there, especially if the lower groups were disproportionately filled with students who are from historically underserved groups. You know, we could unpack a lot. But let me just kind of give you one way to think about this. The most important thing Lauren did was allow students to keep their positive beliefs about themselves, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like the seminal work on the Pygmalion effect, right? They believed they were above, so they were above. So what I believe here is that when we remove labels, we really do remove limits. Let's go back to this barometer. So surely this story illustrates the importance of relationships and the dangers of labeling students and some of the limits that we put on just by grouping students by ability. But it also illustrates the incredible power of expectations and of high expectations. What Lauren helped happen in her classroom is what Professor Hattie calls student expectations. Take a moment and predict where that might fall on his barometer of influence. Okay, ready for this? Effect size of 1.44, literally off the chart performance. Remember, 0.40, 1 year's worth of growth for 1 year in the classroom. We really have a lot of power as educators. We can influence students' thinking about themselves that accelerates their learning and their performance by up to 400%, and the research shows that. By working through the labels that limit our perception of each other and of our students, by finding out what students expect of themselves, and supporting them in meeting and exceeding those expectations, it becomes a reinforcing loop as students build confidence and push their expectations higher. High expectations for every student is a part of where we're heading on this journey to excellence with equity as the core of that definition of excellence. It's a place where we're liberated from the vestiges of systemic oppression and systemic privilege. It's a goal that we're calling excellence with equity. And we'll get into what that means. What I'm going to do here, I told you one story of a teacher. But now I'm going to share with you a story of a student. But first I'm going to show you some labels that might be put on this student. I'm going to show them to you one at a time. And what I'm going to ask you to do is imagine this student in your mind's eye. Because you may have had students at one point in your career, or even right now, that you're reminded of when you see these descriptors. Can everyone read that? I know the light kind of washes it out. Is it okay? Okay, one at a time. So this child is me. If we just go back to the descriptors, and I'm not going to ask you to share with anyone, but if you just compare what imagery came to mind for you, that I probably share the same imagery compared to the story of the person I'm about to tell you, which is my story. So I was born in Stockholm, Sweden. And I was born there because I was born into a destructive religious cult, which at the time was called the Children of God. And it's a worldwide cult that currently still exists. It's called The Family. A lot of people know about it because HBO did a documentary a few years back called, it was focused on the family, but it was focused on mainly on the child abduction that went on as a part of their practices. Other people know about it because some celebrities' parents were in it, the Phoenix family, River Phoenix, Rain Phoenix, Joaquin Phoenix, Rose McGowan's another one. So every now and then, this kind of comes up. Well, my parents were both searching for something that they felt was missing, which it just left them vulnerable to recruiting. My dad was disillusioned and hopeless after the Vietnam War. And meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Dublin, Ireland, my Irish mother was 15 years old and was feeling lonely and alienated from her family. One day in Dublin, Ireland, she ran into a group who talked to her about community, about love, about God, about peace, and about a spiritual revolution against the system, about a new way of being. Back in Ohio, my dad also thought he found what he was looking for when he ran into the same group with the same message and quickly got sucked up into the world of the Children of God. He eventually ended up in a cult commune in Ireland, and the leader there said that he had a dream that they were supposed to get married. And, this is part of what makes a cult, I guess, is you do whatever the leader says. So they got married, and I guess I'm grateful because I'm here. But the cult sent them to a compound in Scandinavia, and soon after that I was born, just a few months before my mom's 17th birthday. And my brother was born about a year later. But it was this time that we were in Scandinavia that my mom started to question her involvement with this group. It was during that time that my mom became aware of some of the increasingly controversial practices that I would just call strange and downright illegal. Strange and illegal sexual practices. They had started promoting a form of recruitment that the European courts called evangelical prostitution. So it's where the women in the group would go out to nightclubs at night as a form of recruiting. They also started promoting child sex and child-adult sex as a way, and not only a way, but the way to commune with God. And it didn't matter what age you were. So it's just what we would call rape. So at this time, my mom basically was like, I don't think this is the right environment that I want to raise two children in. She's an amazing woman. Amazingly, she did what I've read and heard is almost impossible, which is she deprogrammed herself from the brainwashing. The reason why she deprogrammed herself is because it was really dangerous. She couldn't tell anyone that she wanted out because we would disappear. So when I was 3, my dad brought my brother and I to the U.S., to Ohio. My mom stayed behind. The reason why she stayed behind is because she had issues with her documentation. Not only was she an immigrant, but part of becoming a member of this cult was you gave up your identity and took on this new identity. And part of that was like giving up your old name and taking on a new name. So even though I'm named John Krownapple and my dad's name is John Krownapple, I wasn't named after my dad. I was named after John the Baptist. My dad was not going by John after that at that time. Matter of fact, he wanted to name me Hezekiah, which would have been a much different lived experience for me. I kind of like I think about that. What if I was named Hezekiah? I would have the nickname Hez, which I think would be kind of cool, though. Like, what's up, Hez? Kind of like it. But my mom lobbied to have a more mainstream name for me. But it's kind of trippy. Along the topic of labels, it's kind of interesting even to reflect on your name, which is this label that has been put on you that isn't really you, but it's part of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. It kind of gets deep really quick, like, whoa. The way I view myself totally changed when I realized about 10 years ago that I wasn't named after my dad. Trippy. Okay, let's get back. So eventually, my mom ended up in Ohio after a struggle with her parents, and I just learned a few years ago, her parents really didn't want her to come to the United States. They wanted to help her get out of this cult, and they said, cut your ties, let the cult have them, and if you do, we'll support you. So they were trying to get her to stay and just forget about us. But she, like I said, is pretty exceptional. She traveled over by herself. She met up with my dad in Akron, and told him shortly after that that she wanted nothing else to do with the group. So after she disclosed that, a couple days later, my brother and I disappeared. And when my mom ultimately wrote a book about all this, which eventually she became a writer, and her first book was Our Story, that chapter was called Kidnapped. So we were being hidden from her in a commune about 4 hours south in southern Ohio. She found us, but this was a common practice because child abduction was one of the cult's many legal issues during the 1970s through 1990s. Many children, we were lucky because many of the children ended up in countries like Thailand and Singapore where just there was no way to find where they were. But luckily for us, there were many groups dedicated to help people like my mom get out of destructive situations and get their life back together, and they helped her find us just a few hours away in central Ohio. So after she found us, she spent a lot of time in courts. There were custody issues. all kinds of stuff. She sued the cult for $1 million and won, but she never collected a cent. One thing that happened in the courts is that the judge took our passports away. Took my passport away, my brother's passport away, and my mom's passport, because he was protecting my dad's rights to us. Because my mom just wanted to come get us, bring us back to Ireland where she had support. So, if you think about it, here she was, stuck in 1977, an immigrant, single, divorced mother of two, stuck here in a strange and far-off country, not even 20 years old, without a high school diploma and without a family structure. And I just want to say here, I have to say before I forget, because often I forget, that the story works out in the end. I have a very functional family. It took years of processing to get to that point, because I've lived most of my life thinking I've had a dysfunctional upbringing. But I've realized that that's a way that I've categorized and labeled it based on some of what goes on in society. I have a very functional family. It's just atypical. It's non-normative. My dad and my stepdad meet up for dinner every Thursday night. Neither has been married to my mom for 20 years, but they made it work. So they meet up at Panera every Thursday night. They're the best of friends. All of us spend holidays together. My dad eventually got out of that situation because he wanted a relationship with us. So it's all good. We have a very loving and functional family, although it doesn't look like what shows up in elementary school books often. So 20 years old, and my mom, just a little something about my mom. My mom eventually tapped into assistance. We got Section 8 housing in Akron, Ohio. It just happens to be a community called Channelwood Apartments. It was developed and owned by the historically black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, which, like, I have this special place in my heart for anyone who is a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, because they provided us our first home. And you see these pictures up here. I found a few. If you look at that one in the lower left corner, that's me at school. St. Vincent St. Mary's was right down the road, so I walked to school. This is first grade, and the suit is so awesome. I just have to include that slide because it's, oh man, it's just great. The tie is ridiculous. A lot of people know about St. Vincent's, by the way, because LeBron James made it famous. St. Vincent's was, yeah, Akron, Ohio, LeBron James, Cavs. Oh, nice, yeah. Yeah, so LeBron James and I are tight. We're the best of friends. He just texted me a couple minutes ago and wished me luck, so that was cool. But no, he's a whole generation younger than me, but his mom lived 2 blocks away from where my dad lived in Akron, and I still claim him, even though he has no idea who I am, but got a lot of Akron pride. So anyway, let me get to the point here. About 21 years ago, I told this story to a friend of mine. I started my career as an elementary teacher, and I was telling this story to a colleague of mine. She, of course, was in shock. She said, "John, I would have never have expected any of that from you," which, as I've reflected throughout the years, I've gotten more and more focused on that word expected, because the work that I'm involved in equity, I very much believe in self-fulfilling prophecies and expectations that we have of each other being attached to narratives that we kind of have going on in our subconscious that we need to elevate to our level of consciousness so we can change them if necessary. So when she said, "John, I would have never have expected any of that from you," the next thing she said is, "I would have thought you were the all-American boy growing up in the suburb with the white picket fence and all." So that day was something I never forgot, and it's as clear as it was yesterday, her voice in my head. I think it represents what usually goes through folks' minds before they know me, before they really know me. I believe that when I walk into a room, that based on what people see, they categorize me and lump me into categories of white and of male. And I think those are the two things that are the biggest immutable categories of our dimensions of difference, because they're external. You know, and I think our society is very much racialized, so even if we might not be thinking it, I think it happens subconsciously. They probably lump me into the binary gender category of male with all the cultural meanings and assumptions connected to that. Probably the category of middle class and all the expectations that come along with that. But I really need to slow down here for a second because I think this is the major message that I'd like to convey during our time together. This dynamic that I just described is so very insidious that I want to be explicit about it. So over time, I've learned a few things about what's illustrated here on this slide. First, I believe that I've been conditioned or trained not to see the stuff on the left when I look in the mirror, but instead to see the narrative on my right, and it's kind of a trip because I almost need to remind myself daily that the real me is the one on the left because the one on the right seems a lot more like me, but it's all a fabrication, it's all an invention. Second, I've realized that because of this very same dynamic, I can walk away from this left-hand side at any point in time. At any moment, I can choose to melt into a concept that I just refer to as whiteness. And that's the real concept of the melting pot, by the way. You know, originally it was a poem that was about how do you create a nation out of many European nations? Well, you melt away all your ethnic markers of difference, you know, into being American, which at the time was synonymous with being white. All I have to do to melt and to choose to melt is to keep my story to myself, which I did for many, many years for a number of different reasons that we won't get into here, but a lot of it has to do with shame. I don't even have to act white. I get all those benefits just by default. All I have to do really is do absolutely nothing. And that's because of the concept. It gets called white privilege. It's because of systemic advantage. It's because of that culture is a predominant force and it serves people to varying degrees. So by presenting the way that I do, I get benefits as small as the benefit of the doubt. And that's really not a small benefit. Now, I know there's people here in the room, those among us, with labels such as Black, Hispanic, First Nations, Indigenous, etc., that can't do that. There are those of us that don't have the choice to melt. You can't just walk away from whatever's in your left-hand column. It's because in our American melting pot, there are simply some things that have been deemed unmeltable, and those things are the things that we present on the surface. So, you know, getting to the point of diversity and equity, this is definitely not a diversity conversation that involves all of us smiling, celebrating our differences, singing Kumbaya, and all of that stuff, although there is something beautiful about it. Something remarkably beautiful. But this conversation requires us to sit in the darkness for as long as it takes to work through understanding our culture on every single level, all the way down to our classroom culture. It requires us to work on understanding our culture, figuring out how it serves people to varying degrees, thinking about who is unintentionally served well at the expense of others, who are unintentionally underserved. For me, in general, the dominant culture served me so well that I can come from the background that I came from and still accrue the benefits that society has in store for people who look like me. Historically in our country, the dominant culture doesn't really care about my story, my background, my dimensions of uniqueness and difference. It just wants me to melt and be as white as can be. And it uses several centuries of historical inertia to do just that and make it happen with relative ease. And here's an example of how easy it is. So a couple years ago, when all that stuff went down in Ferguson with Michael Brown, I got an invitation to come out and speak with the local school districts and some educators and that type of thing. Now, my brother lives in St. Louis, and he's never seen me in a professional setting. So I invited, he's only a year younger than me. So I invited him out. I said, hey, Mike, why don't you come out? I'm going to be talking and actually telling some of our family story. I think you might like it. Why don't you come out? And so during the speech, I see him come in the room, so I'm kind of pumped up. And talked to him afterwards, and he says, man, it was very similar because I gave the descriptors of our story, the labels. He said, it took me a whole minute to figure out that was you that we were talking about. And just think about that. Every one of those descriptors also applies to him. That's his story as well. But he also didn't see it. That's how powerful this stuff is, the forces at work. I mean, relative ease. So I just imagine sometimes, if I had different external markers of difference other than markers of maleness, markers of whiteness, and let's just say I had markers of blackness all the way on the other side of the spectrum, skin tone, hair texture, whatever, the way I talked, anything like that. Here's what I believe. I believe that the dominant culture in general would use those markers to make sure that I question myself and my sanity on a daily basis. I think it would make sure that I encountered routine and subtle indignities that would make me question my adequacy and definitely question my belonging. Which, even getting back to Maslow's hierarchy, belonging is underachievement. You have to belong to achieve. But how often in education do we say you have to achieve to belong? Like you belong in this group, you belong in that group, right? It's like we flip it unintentionally. I think if I had all the markers of blackness instead of whiteness, I think that I would feel less than through rampant and subtle low expectations. I think I'd be statistically more likely to be suspended in schools, to be accused of cheating. I'd be more likely to go to prison, and more likely to go through prison through a pipeline of disparities that research shows us starts in preschool, where students who are categorized as black are treated differently for the same behaviors as students that are categorized as white. With everything in the news and how heartbreaking it is with some of the stories that come out, most recently in Dallas, Texas, I think I'd be more likely to be shot by police during routine traffic stops, even if I did absolutely nothing, even if I did exactly what the police officer said, like reach for my wallet. And you might argue with me in your head, but these are the things that I truly believe about my experience. I don't think the dominant culture would really care if I had two parents who lived together, who parked 4 European cars in our driveway. I don't think it would care if I was able to speak 5 languages, because all of the markers of difference would be connected to assumptions that they hold that are very, very deeply ingrained in our psyche. So I'm going to be blunt here, because I think this is the work. I think this work is so very important. It's critical. If we're not doing something every day to work against these systems, then we're participating in keeping them alive and keeping them well. I truly believe that to eradicate injustice, each of us needs to consciously confront the nature of the privilege that we experience, and all of us are. I would say just by the simple fact that we have jobs, we have dimensions of privilege. I feel like we need to confront those and to work against them. At least to work against the systems that confer unearned disadvantages. And that's simply what we call inequities. So this whole process of sitting in the darkness, it is not all gloom and doom. It is beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. So let's try to experience this. Experience sitting in the dark. So if you would, please, humor me and just close your eyes for a moment. And let's try an imagery experience. Imagine You are an acorn buried beneath the ground. It's dark. You can't move. You smell the dampness of the earth that surrounds you. Every sound is muffled. The muffled vibrations from footsteps above you easily could be distant thunder or an earthquake. You start to make up a story of what's happening to you. You're desperate for an explanation because it gives us control. Your mind plays tricks on you. You may be stuck here forever, trapped, maybe even dead. You feel fear, danger. It's scary, lonely. You're vulnerable. You have no idea that you're a seed containing everything you need to become a massive oak tree. Time passes. You slowly start to expand. It feels like you're growing like a slowly inflating balloon. You feel a crack in your outer shell. It spreads until there are many. Your shell begins to open up. Something emerges from your core, something that you didn't even know was there. It startles you, but it is you. Now you're moving. You feel it. You don't know where you're moving to or from, but you are indeed moving. You're slowly pushing soil out of the way until you push against one speck of soil and it becomes a small, blinding spot. That spot is warm. It helps you push faster and stronger. The blinding spot gets bigger as you push the bits of soil away. As the spot gets bigger, you become warmer. And the blinding spot is no longer a spot. It's all around you. It's no longer blinding. You can see. At first blurry, then clarity, you can see. You look down and see the soil. You look up and see bright light. You're still moving toward it, but growing and expanding all the way. You notice that you're not alone. There are many around you, together, others in your forest. In fact, you're growing as a forest. You feel alive, and somehow you know that you always were, even in the darkness. Please now slowly open your eyes. This process represents the inside-out journey that leads to 1, our better selves, and 2, excellence with equity in education for all of our students. The journey has 3 phases, and the first phase I call sitting in the dark, and you'll find a detailed description of that in the book. So let's just think about this mature oak tree that just grew. Let's think about it. If it could talk, if it could just talk to us and interview us using all those neat protocols there that we need to follow when talking to the media. So if that oak tree could talk to us and we would say, what was it like during your time down there beneath the ground? I am sure that oak tree would not describe its time in the dark as like a pleasant experience, as a good time. It surely wouldn't describe it as a time of comfort and bliss. But I'm sure that oak tree would recognize that its time in the darkness was a necessary experience and was a necessary part of its process of growth, a necessary stage on its journey. So I like to use the cultural proficiency framework because it gives us tools. You have the whole equity and diversity department that's very, very much skilled and competent with those tools. But we can also think of cultural proficiency as a journey. So it's content, meaning it's a framework with tools that are pragmatic, but it's also this transformative journey. And when I map it out in the book and try to provide a facilitator map that helps us better understand emergent change, because, by the way, I don't believe that succeeding in terms of equity, I don't think we can get there through planned change. I think we can get to planned change by things like training people on how to turn on computers. But I think with equity, it has to be something much deeper, something that's called emergent change. So part of this is the foundation of the map that you'll find in the book that I use when facilitating groups along on their journey. It's got 3 stages, as you can see. Basically exploration, commitment, and movement. And this is where the journey leads. Excellence with equity. So let's take a quick look at this. You see those circles in the sky? That's my attempt to unpack what a really good definition of equity or excellence might look like when it has equity at its core. How many of you are familiar with this picture? Okay, we had some talk earlier this morning about 504 plans, that type of thing. This image is pretty good. When I first saw it, I thought it was great. The more conversations I've had about it, the more I see its limitations, because it also can be very problematic, this metaphor. So what I think this metaphor does is do a really good job of explaining how, the assumption that our job is to give all students the same thing is a little off. Because the second pane there would indicate that the assumption that our job as educators is to give students exactly what they need. So that difference between equality and equity is good, but there's also a lot of limitations, and actually this metaphor can be damaging because it can also promote deficit thinking in that, it's the kids that's the problem. So that's why I like this third image. Has anyone seen this? Liberation. This actually paints a really good picture for me about, maybe it's the systemic barriers that are the problem. I mean, imagine if students could show up as their authentic selves every day, and that's good. So this is something that I like to keep in mind when thinking about equity. Just a couple notes on inclusion as a goal. Okay? In the United States, in pre-K-12, we've attached the word inclusion and inclusive education to special education. Because in the 1960s, IDEA legislation, all of that, inclusive education became synonymous with issues around special education. I think it's important for us to recognize, though, that is a use of language that is limited to us in pre-K-12 in the United States. Everywhere else in the world, inclusive education is much broader. But it's the same idea that inclusion benefits everybody. That the benefits of diversity, actually, you can tap into them in inclusive environments, where you're not only providing the service that historically marginalized and underserved communities and currently marginalized students need, but also the students who are served well are served even better. They're more prepared for the global economy. They're more prepared to interact in a diverse society. They actually, research shows that their self-efficacy is boosted, that they develop better critical thinking skills. So just think about this. If every day of the year you learn side by side with someone with a much similar lived experience to you, think about that compared to learning side by side with someone with a much different lived experience with you. You can't help but think critically, right? It's like, wow, what is going on in their lives? So we have research that shows that. So this image just suggests here a couple of things. One is that it would benefit us to expand our idea of what inclusive education is. Because we call it culturally responsive teaching here in the United States. Everywhere else in the world it's called inclusive education. The other thing is, with this topic being focused today on climate and engagement, there's an important thing that this image represents, because it's not diversity that's important. Diversity just is. It's there. You get 2 people in a room, you have diversity. It's our response to diversity that's important. These are 4 different diverse environments. Diversity is in every single one of them. So the question for us is, what kind of climate are we shaping? What kind of culture and climate are we shaping? Are we shaping an inclusive culture where it's okay for students to show up as themselves, where they have high interaction, and every single student has a high sense of belonging, which research shows students that experience a high sense of belonging are 4 times more likely to be academically motivated, as well as a slew of other benefits. And cultural competence, quick note about cultural competence, real simple. Unless we include cultural competence in our definition of excellence, kids get hurt. So putting together some pieces here as we wrap this thing up here this morning. So my attempt here with this graphic is to put some of the jargon in place in terms of how all of this works together. So people often ask, well, what about culturally responsive teaching? So here's one way to think about it. If cultural proficiency is our journey of personal and organizational change, it's this ongoing journey to our better selves and toward excellence with equity, then how does our journey show up in our practice? It's through culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive leadership. Now, over the past couple of years, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with educators everywhere in the United States that say, we used to have time to form relationships. We just have so much to get in nowadays. I try to unpack that in chapter 1 of the book because it's really interesting when you look at the progression of our educational policy, starting with A Nation at Risk in 1980, then what happened with the standards-based movement, and then what happened with, quote, closing achievement gaps, and how that's actually worked against some of our goals of equity. A good leadership conversation with your leadership teams would be to use pages 14 through 17 in that book and to promote a discussion about what are we really trying to accomplish here? Why are we doing what we're doing? Anyway, I put teacher-student relationships as the heart of culturally responsive teaching on this graphic because that whole approach of culturally responsive pedagogy assumes that relationships are central to learning. Like you can't do it unless relationships are lifted up. And it can't be separate. It can't be like, oh, we don't have time to form relationships. It can't be partitioned out like that. So let me just give you a little bit more details and let's end this thing on the ground with what we can do. Very much connected with your fundamental 3, climate and engagement. So when I mentioned earlier, what are the moderating variables with teacher-student relationships? Okay, it's one thing to know, wow, teacher-student relationships is important. It's not this soft thing. It really does affect student achievement. But that alone doesn't really tell us much. So here's what the research says. The biggest variable in student-teacher relationships that results, actually the effect size on this is above 0.72. It's huge. It's what's called non-directivity. So we'll unpack that in a moment because that term is kind of confusing, or could be confusing. The second is empathy. I've seen this resurgence in the term empathy everywhere. Like I see it everywhere now, focusing on empathy. Warmth. The idea of a warm demander has been around for quite a while in equity circles as far as teachers who are successful teaching all students. Adapting to differences, okay, changing based on who's in front of us. Encouraging learning, so it's not good enough just to be warm and inviting, but we have to integrate that into our expectations around what and how students learn, and then higher order thinking. So we can't just have warm, fuzzy relationships and not parlay that into beliefs about really higher order thinking. It's really appropriate to unpack non-directivity since we had like a student voice speaker this morning, because those two things are synonymous. So here's other ways to think of non-directivity. Basically, as an educator, we are not being directors. So we're not saying, you do this, you do that, you do that. We're collaborating and partnering with students in terms of what we learn and how we do it. Another way to think about it, non-directivity, is democratic environments. Okay. Democratic environments, for example, when students work with their teachers to create shared expectations in the classroom. That's a real simple example, but it's that type of environment where they have ownership over their own classroom environment, as opposed to the teacher saying, this is the rules, which would be a more directive approach. Student-centered learning, that's another way to think of non-directivity. Power sharing in social justice circles, we talk about power sharing a lot, recognizing the power that we hold as teachers that's just conferred to us simply by our job titles, and then what we do with that power, how we share it with students. You all are like waist deep in the Danielson framework, right, in Nevada? Yeah, so the Danielson framework gives language to this idea. They call it the student assumption of responsibility. It's one of the common themes that permeates all 4 domains. So when you look at the rubrics that the Danielson framework has, the levels of 3 and 4 performance, you'll see it. I mean, if you didn't before, you'll see it now. You'll see non-directivity. You'll see student assumption of responsibility. You'll see students stepping up and owning their routines in the classroom, their choice of how they're assessed and learning and all of that. And a simple way to think about it is student voice. I like that because I'm more of a metaphor person, so I like the concept of like voice as a metaphor. And right along with that is choice. Here's a real simple way to think about student voice. How can we listen to students, learn from students, and lead with students every day in the classroom? Outside of Professor Hattie's research on the effect size stuff, the Qualia Institute, their odds analysis showed that students' perception of their voice, basically students who believe their voice matters in school, are 7 times more academically motivated than students who feel like their voice does not matter, like their identity is being stifled. It's huge. So to wrap things up here, it's no coincidence that under Fundamental 3 with climate and engagement, forming positive and restorative relationships is the first thing on there. And I truly believe that's the heart of this work. That's equity. So it comes up first and foremost on that list, which I think is very, very symbolic. A note to keep in mind with all that effect size stuff, that's all meta-analyses on meta-analyses, so it's not disaggregated. So that's a thing to really keep in mind, because it's a good start to think about those teacher-student variables, relationship variables, like empathy, but then we need to bring an equity lens to it because it doesn't already have an equity lens. So for instance, how can I develop my empathy with students as a start? But then the next step is, how can I develop my empathy with students who have had a much different lived experience than me, especially if that lived experience is part of a tradition of marginalization historically. And so that's the real work. How can we work on changing our minds, changing ourselves, so we can change the lives of our students in really, really positive ways? So thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be able to speak with you and actually have people listen, or I'm assuming you're listening. You could be doing something else in your brain. But I'm really humbled by the opportunity to speak here in front of you. My email address, my Twitter handle is just at @Krownapple. My email address is john.krownapple. I believe that what's inside that book there is something for every leader. So feel free to drop me an email if you want me to point out some things like, hey, I'm struggling with a team that is resisting change. Is there anything you can point me to in the book? And I'll just shoot you off a quick email that says, yeah, chapter 14, that type of thing. So feel free to reach out. Best wishes on your journey, and thank you so much for having me.